Hello and welcome to the 6th video in my Masterclass series, and this one's all about bringing everything together using the all new and brilliant Pattern Creator. So if you're one of those people that's got lost in the sea of endless new features we've been releasing over the past 2 or 3 weeks, fear not, the Pattern Creator will bring all that together and make it a lot easier for you. Now the Pattern Creator allows us to create melodic sequences and chordal backing, and we do that from the Pattern Creator window, which you can access via the menu. So if we go to Open Windows, and we can select the Chord Creator from here. We can also access the Chord Creator by swiping down on the Global Randomize button. So if I just swipe down, you'll get the same window here. Now I want you to notice that this dialog has 3 tabs: Melody, Chords, and the last one is Bass. And each of these allows you to create different sequences, pattern sequences, over one or more patterns. And we're going to talk about them one at a time, starting with the Melody tab. Now the Melody tab is the brainchild of David Collett. Now not only does he help me with manuals, he comes out with some great ideas. Now the most important part about creating a memorable or recognisable melody is to have little motifs, little sequences of notes which are constantly repeated. Now these repeats can be transposed, inverted, played backwards or slightly modified, but the key is you hear a repetition going on. Now many popular songs like I'll Be Waiting have these motifs, and you can see them ringed here, and each repeat is either transposed or slightly modified. And as you can see from this score here, there are only 3 motifs throughout the whole song. But it's that repeated motif pattern that makes the songs memorable. The same can be said for Somewhere Over the Rainbow. As you can see here, the motifs repeated and transposed. The melody in this case is constructed of 2 different motifs. We can see that the motif in red is repeated 3 times at different pitches, and the motif in blue is repeated twice with different pitches. The popular song Autumn Leaves uses the same motif multiple times, only at lower pitches each time. The motif is repeated 8 times before a chorus, and then back to repeating the motif again. And finally, another classic song, The Nearness of You, has the same motif repeated multiple times, with nothing but small variations in pitch. So hopefully those examples give you an idea of why motifs are so important in popular music. So the Melody tab of the Pattern Creator is used to create melodic sequences on motifs, which are repeated and transposed. So as you can see, there are 2 rows of knobs on this Melody tab. The top row of knobs is all about creating a pattern and the motif, and the bottom row of knobs is all about motif variance. In other words, how we deviate from the motif. Now for now we're just going to focus on that top row of knobs. On the left we have the start and end pattern, so this generator is able to create sequences over multiple patterns if needed. We have a pattern length, which is simply the length of each pattern we create, and then we have 3 really important knobs: the max note jump, the max motif jump, and the motif length. So with a motif length set to 4 like we have here, it's going to create a sequence of 4 notes, and then it's going to repeat that series of 4 notes with various changes, shifts, transpositions, and so on. By default, the motif starts on the root note, and the max note jump determines how many scale degrees that we can move as we move between the different notes of the motif. So we have a value of 2 here for max note jump, which means that we can move 2 scale degrees each time we randomize a note of the motif. And that in real terms equates to 2 positions of the note fader. The max motif jump determines how far we can transpose a motif up and down in scale degrees, and currently we're set to 2. So the motif can be transposed up or down by 2 fader positions. So let's see this in action. Now don't forget the shortcut to open the pattern creator. Just swipe down on the global randomize button, and the first thing I'm going to do is select a different scale. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to pick the major scale. So we're in C major right now, and you can see that reflected on the top of the pattern creator dialog. Now I'm going to drag the pattern creation window over so that we can see the notes that are generated, and I'm going to hit the generate button, and let's take a listen. Now it's all a little bit pedestrian, so let's speed it up a bit and go with 8th notes. And let's try randomizing a new melody, but one that we can see the pattern, like here. We can see the first 4 notes that make up the motif, and we can see how they're then transposed across the pattern. I've kept it simplistic for now so we can see what's going on. So let's take a listen. Now notice how, as we're generating these patterns, how it's also transposing the octave lane behind us. Now obviously that's not so interesting, so let's try moving the motif length up and setting that to 8, and we'll get a little bit longer motif. Now with the pattern length set to 16, we'll get 2 motifs within this pattern. Now, as I said before, these are very simplistic motifs so you can hear them. But I'm going to set the motif length down to 4 and start manipulating some of these variance knobs at the bottom here. And these will manipulate the duplicates, the duplicate motifs, and make them sound a little bit more interesting. So I've set the inversion to 42%, which means there's a 42% likelihood that we'll get an inversion. And I've set the deviation to 21%, which means we get a 21% deviation from the notes in the motif, so that's altered slightly. So let's try adjusting the retrograde, which is simply playing the motif backwards. Set that to say 37%, which means we've got a 37% chance of that particular motif being reversed. And now let's introduce some ties. So as you can hear there, a tie is just simply a held note, and the ties are applied to the motif so that every single motif, even if it's been transposed, still has ties in a recognisable place, again helping us with memorising the rhythm as well as the pitch. Now obviously the longer the motif length, the more ties make sense. Now by default motif ties are turned on, but we could turn this off. And this allows us to insert ties not necessarily in the motif, but randomly throughout the pattern. But I think to actually create the sense of a rhythmic pattern, it's best to keep it turned on. Now in the bottom right of this dialog we have a motif accents checkbox, and if I turn this on, you'll see that in the velocity lane every first note of the motif is accented, whereas if I turn it off we get no accented notes on the beginning of the motif. Again, I think it's nice for it to be on and actually hear the emphasis on the beginning of the motif. Now if we set the end pattern to say 4 and hit the generate button, you'll see that we get 4 patterns of notes created, and I can switch between them here. I also want you to notice that the pause button is enabled, and that will prevent the patterns from switching while we're in this dialog. But if I turn off the pause and rewind and then press play, you'll see that it's actually chained these patterns together, and when we get to the last pattern it'll cycle back to the first. Now I want you to notice when we switch to pattern 3 that the first note is not en route, and that's simply because this start note here is set to 2, so we're able to move up and down from that root note 2 scale degrees or 2 fader increments. Now I'm going to turn ties off, and I'm going to set the start note max jump to 0 and generate a new pattern. We've got 4 patterns there, so let's rewind to the beginning of those and start playback. Now the one thing I want you to notice is that when we jump to the second pattern, it starts on the root note. So all these patterns now will begin on the root note, but they'll all be completely different. Now what you may have noticed is that patterns 2, 3 and 4 a different pattern speed, a different note length. Now normally we can just select a pattern and then select a new note length and do that for each of the patterns. But if we hold down the chord follow button, it becomes a shift, and when we select a new note length it sets every single pattern that we have to that new note length. Now with all the best will in the world, I don't expect you to remember what all this does, but there's no substitute for experimentation, and if you just play around with some of these knobs, hit the generate button, you'll find yourself generating really nice patterns very quickly. So that brings us on to the Chords tab, and the Chords tab is another really exciting feature. Now this one is my brainchild, and I'm going to show you how it works. Now when you switch to the Chords tab, the first thing you notice is these 3 pulsating knobs. Now these 3 knobs, chord notes, complexity and chord articulation, are real-time knobs that apply settings in real time. You don't have to press the generate button. But what I want to do is just move the creator window out the way and press the generate button. And let's take a listen to what that generates. Now because the chord complexity is a live knob, i.e. pulsing, I can change this and we can hear effects in real time. So currently the chord notes is set to root, 3rd and 5th notes, and complexity was 2. I'm going to set complexity to 3 and move the chord notes down to root and 5th. Now because the chord notes is set to play 2 notes, the root and 5th, and the complexity is 3, it's adding an extra random note. If you've gone through the chord editor, you'll know exactly what that means. If I now set that chord complexity to 4, it's going to play 4 notes using the root and fifth and 2 random notes. Now generally I find it more pleasing to have, say, 2 or 3 notes played with the chord and then add an additional note on top of that as like a melody. Now I want you to notice that the chord length is set to 4, which explains why each chord is spread over 4 vertical columns. Now we're currently generating chords and they're played back quite slowly because the note length is set to quarter notes, but let's try upping that to 8 notes and see how that sounds. I think the faster speed sounds a whole lot better. Now I want you to notice when I hit the generate button, we get a different set of chords every time. And notice the rhythmic pattern that are determined by these 2 knobs, minimum and maximum note length, which are set to 1 and 2. Now the actual chords that we're playing are determined by this custom chord sequence down here. And they are being randomized each time I hit the generate button because the chord progressions knob is set to random. Now I said earlier that the 3 glowing buttons are live buttons, and if we manipulate these we can see in real time, for instance when I change the chord notes, how it changes the notes that appear in the chord editor. When I change the complexity value, it's changing it for each of the generated chords. Now we can also use the chord articulation knob to add articulation to the first note of each chord. Obviously we've got the chord length set to 4 at the minute, but anything that starts on beat 1 gets an articulation attached. And these articulations are very much governed by the chord notes and the complexity. For instance, if you sign a strum, you'll need more notes for the strum, so you'll need to increase the complexity and so on. But it's a little bit of trial and error adding these chord articulations, and some work better than others. Now let's adjust the rest chance. I'm going to set this to 27, so there's a 27% chance of a rest when I press the generate button. Now currently we're producing chords with a length of 1 to 2 notes, but if I up that maximum note length to 4 and hit generate, you'll see that we get something a little bit more sparse with more ties. If I set the minimum maximum note length to 2 and hit generate, we're going to see a chord every 2 steps. If I want a chord every 4 steps, I just set the min max to 4 and then regenerate. For a little bit more variety, I'm going to move the minimum length down to 1 and then regenerate. Now if I set the chord length to 8 events or 8 steps and then regenerate, you'll see that the chord, we only play 2 chords of the sequence that we can see down below. Now if we set the chord length to 16 and hit generate, you'll see we only get 1 chord. Now this is really useful because if we want 1 chord per pattern, I can just set the end pattern to 4. Actually, I've just realised that there's actually 5 chords in this particular pattern. So I'll set that to 5. And when I hit the generate button, it's going to generate 5 patterns. And each of these patterns has a separate chord. Now, as we mentioned before, if you constantly generate different patterns, it will generate a new set of chords, but that is not always what you want. Sometimes you want to either keep the existing chord sequence or you want to generate your own chord sequences. Now, by using the chord progression knob, you could either select an alternate sequence or select custom and define your own. Now if you select a custom sequence, you'll see that every time I press the generate button, it's just generating a rhythmic pattern and not actually changing the chords. So if I put the chord progression back on the default, which was randomize, and hit the generate button, you'll see that it'll generate a chord set. If I try and edit the chord set by clicking on any of these chord progression buttons down the bottom here, it'll change that chord progression knob to custom, which means that it will actually stay on custom and stay on that custom chord that you define. You can also pick one of the default custom chord sequences using the chord progression knob, and again, if we do a randomization, it will maintain that chord sequence. Now we talked briefly before about adding chord articulation, and if we change the chord articulation knob, you'll see that the first note of every chord has an articulation attached. Now there's a flip articulation checkbox in the bottom right corner, and when this is selected and we randomize a sequence, everything other than that first note is applied an articulation. So that concludes the basic explanation of the chords tab. Essentially, you just need to play with it and just see how it works best for you. The next one along is the bass tab, which is used for creating tight bass sequences. And the reason I say tight is because we've got this upper and lower limit on the bass tab, which allow us to specify a range of notes to fluctuate from what we consider as a start note. So here I've set the lower limit to 0, which will be equal to the root note, and the upper limit as +6, which is 6 scale steps or scale degrees, and they're measured from what we set as the start note, in this case C. Now on the bottom left we have a minimum and maximum note length, which is set to 1 for the lower and 2 for the upper, which means we're going to be generating notes with a length of either 1 or 2 beats. Now currently the motif length is set to 4, and motif has a special meaning in terms of bass. It's the number of consecutive notes before we reset back to the start note. Since the maximum note jump is set to 2, that means there'll be a maximum of 2 scale degrees between notes. So let's press the generate button and generate our first bass line. And if we move this dialog out the way, we can see what we're up against. Now immediately for me this is too slow, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit, rewind and replay. Now the bass isn't too adventurous because the limits that I placed on it were quite strict. So if I alter those limits, you'll see that the bass line is not so restricted in its movement. So let's try increasing the maximum note length. And let's try increasing the distance between the notes. So I'm going to restrict that back to 2, so there's only 2 scale offsets between consecutive notes. And then I'm going to enable this octave jump checkbox down in the bottom left. Now we can see the octave jump here in the octave lane. And because this is completely random, there aren't guaranteed to be any octave jumps, so I'm going to randomize again. And that time we got 2 octave jumps. Now this is very good on things like synth basses or slap bass. Now let's try adjusting the rest chance, which is, I'm going to set to 28. Which means there's a 28% chance that there's going to be a rest. Now right now the motif length is set to 4 and it will never produce a rest on the first note of a motif. So with a low motif length, it's quite possible that you're going to get no rest whatsoever. Now we also have a coin flip chance, which is the percentage chance that a coin flip will happen. Now if you've been watching previous videos, you'll know that a coin flip is in itself a chance that a particular note is either going to be a rest, be a tie, or be randomized. And right now I have 3 coin flips on display. And every time that the master cursor gets to the end of the pattern length, it will change what these coin flips are going to play. So by increasing the number of coin flips, you add some variability into your bass lines. So now we have an understanding of what the 3 tabs do. How about combining them? Because you can combine them in some great ways. So let's start by finding an interesting chord pattern. And when we find something that's interesting, we can switch to the melody tab and apply a melody over the top. So there's tons of fun to be had by combining the chords with either the bass all the melody patterns, and I just give you a glimpse there of what you can do. Now the final thing I want to talk about today is the ability to rotate patterns using these left and right arrows in the top corner of the display. And that's great if you generate a pattern and then want to move whichever chord starts the pattern. So that's just about it for this video. I'm sure there'll be more to come in the coming weeks, but for now, don't forget to thumb up the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time.